We have talked in the earlier lecture about the individual demand curve, but individual demand curve has an assumption which states that when the price comes down, the quantity a consumer would want to consume would increase. That's not true all the time. So, a better approach to evaluate individual preferences would be an indifference curve. This is an alternate approach to analyze what quantity or how much the consumer is going to consume when the price falls and the kind of utility that they derive out of consuming several bundles of choices when they are given choices. Also, the consumer does not consume only one commodity or one good or one service. They consume a bundle or a number of goods and services, X, Y, Z, anything. So we will use the indifference analysis. As the name suggests, the consumer is indifferent to whatever bundle they are consuming and at whatever point they are consuming. The satisfaction they derive out of every bundle lying on the indifference curve is the same. So how do we draw an indifference curve? Let's have a look. On the x-axis we have good X, and on the y-axis we will have good Y. We draw an indifference curve which looks something like this, right? They can consume at any point. The point can be here, can be here, can be here. As long as the point is lying on the curve, the consumer is indifferent to whichever basket or whichever bundle they use. What do I mean by bundle and basket? Let's have a look. If the consumer is consuming at this point, it's evident that at point X, the point A, let's call it A. At point A, the quantity of consumer good X consumed is less, whereas the quantity of good Y consumed is more. At the other point, which is point B, some quantity of good X that the consumer is consuming now at this point has increased, whereas some quantity of good Y that the consumer had been previously consuming has come down. And similarly, we have another point. But the point is, no matter at which point the consumer is consuming, whether at point A, B or C, A, B and C are called individual bundles. These are individual bundles or combinations of good X and good Y. In one bundle there is more of good X, in the other bundle there is more of good Y. But no matter at which point they consume, they are indifferent, means the amount of utility or satisfaction they derive out of each of these bundles is the same. But do we talk only about one indifference curve when we are talking about one consumer? Are we going to talk only about one indifferent curve? No, we talk about various indifferent curves. Which the indifference curve basically slopes downward, and it indicates that a fall in quantity consumed of one good is accompanied by an increase in the consumption of the other good, as I explained that when the consumer moves from point A to point B, they consume less of good Y and start consuming more of good X. That is why the curve is downward sloping. We can, however, produce an indifference map. What is an indifference map? Let's have a look at it. An indifference map contains more than one indifference curves. This is called the indifference map. This shows a number of indifference curves. Let's call it curve 1, indifference curve 2, and indifference curve 3. It shows that the consumer has more than one combination of goods for all three levels of satisfaction. Each indifference curve shows a different level of satisfaction. As the curve moves up, satisfaction level increases, right? As we know that whenever there is a right shift, there is an increase. Whenever there is a left shift, there is a decrease. So as the indifference curve keeps moving higher up, the satisfaction level of the consumer increases. Higher indifference curves represent higher levels of satisfaction. If the consumers, according to the assumption, are actually being rational when preferring to be on a higher, they will prefer to be on a higher indifference curve rather than the lower indifference curve. One property of the indifference curve is that they never cross each other. They will never intersect with each other. They will lie either on the right of each other or on the left of each other, but they will never cross each other. However, the consumer will be willing to substitute one product for the other. For example, when the consumer is moving from this point to this point, or from this point to this point, or from this point to this point, obviously the consumer is leaving some amount of one good to increase the amount of the other good. That is called marginal rate of substitution. It's called marginal rate of substitution. We will speak about it in detail when we will combine the indifference curves and the budget line or the budget constraint. What is a budget line? Obviously, the consumer wants to derive maximum utility out of whatever they are spending, but they have a constraint when it comes to expenditure. What is that constraint? The constraint is obviously the budget or their income. Consumers have limited disposable income. Another constraint is prices of goods. Consumers have to look at both these things while deciding upon the bundle that they would select to maximize their utility. These two concepts of disposable income and prices of goods, they determine consumer behavior and consumer choices. They can be represented through a budget line. That this is a line, right? It's a line, a straight line. It numerically shows the possible combination of two goods that a consumer can purchase. For example, this can be a budget line. This is good X and this is good Y. The extreme points means the intercepts on both axes. Here this is 0 unit of good X and here we have 0 unit of good Y. There can be several bundles that will lie on this very same line, but the prices will be such that they are in a budget. For example, let's say good X and good Y. Good X price is $10 each and good Y price is $20 each. Let's say the budget is $200, right? So the combinations can be starting from 10, and for X we will have, we can also analyze it numerically, that if the person buys only 10 units of Y and 0 units of X, they will exhaust the entire budget. When we are talking about budget lines, we assume that the consumer is allocating the entire budget between these two products or these two goods. The budget line, like the other curves in economics, they also show a movement and a shift. It can be a pivotal shift or a normal rightward or a leftward shift. The meaning of the shift is the same. This is the original line. If it shifts towards right, means the income has increased. This is called a shift, complete shift. The other one is a pivotal shift. Pivotal shift can be of two types. Either it shifts like this. Pivot means stays fixed. At one point it stays fixed. It can stay fixed on the y-axis and move here on the x-axis. The movement can be inward as well with a pivotal shift. Okay, and the other kind of pivotal shift is like this, where it stays pivoted on the x-axis and moves a bit on the y-axis. It will look something like this. Right? So both of them are pivotal shift. This is pivotal and this is also pivotal. Why does it shift? Let's have a look at it. We have cases. Same income, change in price of one good. This will be a pivotal shift. Let's take an example. Price of X, price of good X falls. Right? It means that more of good X can be purchased within the same income. The budget line will move outward from its pivot at a point. For example, this will look something like this. Good X. The price of good X has fallen. The price of good Y is same and income is also the same. It means that the consumer can purchase the same amount of good Y right now, but they will be able to purchase greater quantity of good X. Greater quantity, it will move outward on the x-axis. Right? So we can see how the line moves. We will move outward on the x-axis because the consumer will be able to buy more of good X. Suppose if the price of X falls by half, in this case the price of X was $10. If it falls by half and it says that the price is now $5, right? The price of X is $5. If now the price of X is $5, then let's see how much we can buy when we have $200 budget, right? Here we have 0. Here we have 184, right? Here we have 168, right? Then 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 32, 36 and 40. 40 multiplied by 5 is 200. So this becomes 40. Earlier it was 20, right? And y remains the same, 10. This is a pivotal shift when price of one good has fallen while the income stays the same and price of other goods stays the same. As price of X has fallen relative to Y, which is unchanged, consumers will substitute X for Y. This pivotal shift is representative of the substitution effect. This is the substitution effect, but it is substitution effect of what? Substitution effect of price change, because the pivotal shift has occurred due to change of price of one good. It's always the case that the rational consumer will substitute towards the good which has become relatively cheaper. With the fall in price of X, the consumer actually has more money to spend on other goods, X included. Okay, real income has therefore increased. Real income has increased because if the consumer is saving some money on X, they can spend it on some other good as well. It means that the consumer may now purchase even more of good X and other goods also. This is called the income effect of price change. So there are two things. Substitution effect of price change is when the consumer is willing to substitute one product for the other, and they will naturally be inclined towards the product, good or service which has become cheaper and the price of which has dropped. Income effect of price change will be that the consumer will actually have more money to spend on good X whose price has dropped. They will have even more money to spend on good X, and they will be able to buy more of good X with the same amount of money that they have. This is called the income effect of price change. Let's observe the effect of a change in income on consumption of good X and good Y. How do we observe that? We combine the indifference curve and the budget lines to observe that. We can see that there is a right shift in the budget line from B1 to B2, which means that the income has increased. Right shift in the budget line means income has increased. Also, we can see that there are two indifference curves lying on each of the budget lines. One is the old indifference curve, IDC1. Other is the new indifference curve, IDC2. As the budget line has shifted to right, there is a new indifference curve with reference to that budget line as well. Now, what is the optimum combination of products or optimum bundle that the consumer would be consuming? When budget line is B1, optimum bundle is E1, which is this point. What is E1? E1 is the optimum point of consumption. Optimum point of consumption E1 lies on the budget line, but it is the point where the curve is tangent to the budget line. Tangent means touching at one point only. For budget line 2, E2 is the point of optimum consumption where IDC2 is tangent to the budget line B2. A consumer's choice is optimum at these 2 points. If the income increases, then this will allow the consumer to choose a better combination of X and Y. When the income increases, the consumer will be able to consume more of good X and more of good Y, both. So if the budget constraint or the budget line shifts outwards from B1 to B2, then the consumer will increase the consumer of good X from X1 to X2 and the consumption of good Y from Y1 to Y2. Also, we can see that the optimum point of consumption has changed or shifted from E1 to E2. This is what occurs when both goods are normal goods. What are normal goods? Normal goods are those goods which a consumer wants to consume more when the income rises. In case of a normal good, the consumer would want to consume more of this good when the income rises. If the budget constraint results in less of one good being consumed, then this is indicative that the good is an inferior good. It means that when the income rises but the consumption of one good falls, that good is an inferior good. Why? What does an inferior good mean? The inferior good means that the consumer wants to consume less of this good when income increases. An example is low quality cheap food. People who are poor will feed their children cheap quality food, but as their income rises, they would want to feed their children with superior quality food. So the food that is cheap quality is inferior good, and the food which is in demand more when income rises, that is called the normal good. When there is a fall in consumer income, the budget line will definitely shift inward. Here we can see that the budget line has shifted outwards. That's why we can see that the income has increased. There can be an inward shift as well, which would mean that the income of the person has decreased. But this change or this shift will always be parallel, right? This shift will always be parallel. If when each good consumed comes down, when there is a fall in consumer income and the budget also falls, the consumer wants to decrease the consumption of both the goods, then means that both the goods are normal goods. If in that case one good would have been inferior, the consumer would have wanted to increase consumption of inferior good in case of fall in the income, right? Income effects and substitution effects when there is an increase in the price of a normal good, which in this case is X. We can see that the price of good X has increased, because of which the budget line has shifted inwards. Why? Because initially the consumer was able to purchase this amount of good X, but now they have to purchase less amount of good X because of increase in the price of good. Therefore, we can safely say that their purchasing power with regards to good X has come down. They can purchase less of good X, whereas there has been no change in the price of good Y. That is why there has been no change in the graph for good Y, and both the budget lines are pivoted here at this point. Secondly, now the new budget line is B2, which has moved inwards, and the price of good Y has stayed unchanged. For this, the graph that we are looking at on the screen, the change has occurred in two stages. One is movement along the curve I1 from point E2 to point E1, right? From point E2 to E1. This is the substitution effect. This is the substitution effect because the consumer started consuming less of product X or less of good X. We can observe it clearly here that at point E they were consuming more of good X. They have moved inwards and have started consuming less of good X to consume more of good Y. we can see there's a change in the quantity of y as well. The point to note here is that substitution effect, it occurs on the same indifference curve, and it's a movement along the indifference curve, right? It's called the substitution effect because the consumer buys less of good X as it's now more expensive relative to good Y. Then there's another movement, which is the shift downwards to a lower indifference curve, which is I2. We can see that moving from, there has been a movement from E2 to E3, this one. This is called the income effect because these 2 points are lying on 2 different indifferent curves. The consumer has less spending power at point E3 due to increase in the price of good X. Income effect is negative, resulting in a decrease in consumption of both the goods, right? We can see that income effect is negative. It has resulted in decrease in consumption of both the goods. Why? Because real income decreases, the consumer is consuming this quantity of Y, this quantity of Y. But at the old budget line, the consumer was consuming this quantity of Y. So we can see that income effect and substitution effect both are demonstrated in the same graph. How did we calculate the income effect, by the way? The income effect is calculated when we drew the new budget line. This is also tangent to the curve. Wherever this imaginary line is tangent to the curve, from that point to the other indifference curve, the new indifference curve, that will be the income effect. As we can see that there is a parallel shift in the budget line, right? We always look at the income effect when we look at the parallel shift in the budget line. In this graph, we are going to observe the substitution and income effect when there is a decrease in the price of a normal good. As the price of good X, which is a normal good, has decreased, it means there is a rise in real income of the consumer. The fall in price is equivalent to the rise in real income of the consumer, because this is the amount which the consumer can use to purchase more of good X. As the price has decreased and the quantity will be increased, we can easily say that B1 is the old budget line, it's highlighted here as well, and B2 is the new budget line, as the consumer can purchase more of good X. B3 is the imaginary budget line. We need the imaginary budget line to find out the income effect. Also, the imaginary budget line needs to be parallel to the new budget line, not the old budget line, right? So we can see what is the income effect here. The income effect is from E2 to E3. Income effect is from E2 to E3. Why from E2 to E3? Because the budget line has moved from B1 to B2, right? It has moved from B1 to B2 and not the other way around. The price has decreased, so the budget line has moved outwards. That's why the income effect is from E2 to E3. Initial equilibrium is at E1 because that is the point tangent to the old indifference curve. That is why that's the point of initial equilibrium. Also, the movement along the initial indifference curve from point E1 to E2 is the substitution effect, as E2 is tangent to the imaginary budget line. In case of an inferior good, the income effect leads to a fall in the quantity demanded, which will work against the substitution effect. In this figure, X is an inferior good, the quantity demanded for which will decrease as the real income of the consumer increases. The income effect for inferior good is from E2 to E3, as E3 lies on the new budget line and is the point where the indifference curve is tangent to the budget line. Substitution effect, on the other hand, is from E1 to E2, as E2 is the point which lies on the imaginary budget line. In case of inferior goods, substitution effect outweighs the income effect and the overall quantity demanded rises. The overall change here in quantity is from E1 to E3. The curve is downward sloping, which means that a fall in price increases the quantity demanded. When a good is inferior and income effect outweighs the substitution effect, it is called a Giffen good, which we are going to observe now. A Giffen good is a low-income, non-luxury product for which demand increases as the price increases and vice versa. A Giffen good has an upward sloping demand curve, which is contrary to the fundamental laws of demand, which are based on a downward sloping curve. The concept of Giffen good is limited actually to very poor communities. For example, meat is a luxury, and if meat becomes expensive, it is much more expensive than rice. Rice is the only product that you can buy even if it becomes expensive. If the price of rice goes up, the real income of a poor family significantly reduces. Therefore, with a reduction in the disposable income, that family is going to buy less meat, and to compensate for less meat, they are going to buy rice so that they can gain enough calories. Let's talk about two products, meat and rice. Meat on the y-axis and rice on the x-axis. We start at Q2. The rise in the price of rice reduces the budget line for rice to B2, but the fall in income causes a large income effect that outweighs the substitution effect. Demand for rice rises to Q3 with a big fall in the demand for meat. In case of a Giffen good, the substitution effect is positive because the demand for them rises as a result of decrease in their prices relative to the substitute's unchanged prices. Income effect, on the other hand, is as the actual income rises because of decrease in the price of the Giffen good, consumers' demand for Giffen good declines as they switch to more superior goods. The total impact of price reduction is the fall in the demand, and it occurs because of the negative income effect, which is stronger than the positive substitution effect in case of a Giffen good. In simple terms, the increase in demand because of the positive substitution effect is less than the reduced demand because the negative income effect. Hence, the demand for Giffen good changes directly with the price. That is, the demand decreases with the when the price decreases and increases when the price increases. Also, as stated earlier, Giffen goods break the laws of demand as their demand curve slopes upwards. Indifference curve model aims to provide a simple representation of the reality and can be used to predict consumer behavior when only two goods are involved and the income of consumer is fixed. With these assumptions, it's reasonably straightforward for a consumer to be indifferent to the combination of the given two goods that will provide a particular level of satisfaction. The three main limitations of this model are: in reality, consumers are not restricted to just two goods. They have many goods to choose from, and sometimes they may have to choose between hundreds of goods. Also, the term indifference implies that the consumers are willing to accept any combination represented on the indifference curve. Whereas in reality, some consumers express their needs and wants in terms of preferences or rank and order, not in terms of indifference. And the last limitation is that indifference curve assumes that the consumer is always rational, which is not entirely true. With this, we come to the end of this topic.